You mean to tell me you can make things on your 3D printer that are functional instead of just things that are pretty? So my buddy's got this old Ford van, and since he bought the thing, he's converted it into this sick camper van thing that suits his hiking and camping and generally adventurous lifestyle. While he was converting the van, he made the inside a really nice place to be, complete with heat, AC, running water to some degree, all of the things required to make it a nice livable space. And then on the outside, he's kept it pretty well the same as he bought it. Put some wheels and tires on it to make it look sweet, buffed it up and sent her down the road. Now for being a 90s Ford van, it's in reasonable shape. But now that he's lived with it, there are a couple of things that he wants to address, and he approached me about helping him with a few projects. The first project that he needed a solution for was these propane canisters that you get to power your grills and heaters and all those sorts of things. So the heat in his van runs off of these little cans, so he needs a good way to store several of them because he's going to be using them a lot more frequently. Ideally, he wanted something to hold them secure and also keep them from clanging together while you're going down the road. So the requirements for this project were as follows. They need to be secure enough to hold the canisters to this rear door so they wouldn't fly out of there when the door was slammed. They needed to be designed in such a way that the cans could be easily removed still, especially if you had a couple of them mounted on top of each other on the door. And then the back of the piece needed to be strong enough that you could send a screw through it to mount it anywhere on the piece, because we weren't sure where they were going to be drilled in quite yet, so we needed that flexibility. Finally, these pieces needed to be thin enough in profile that they didn't protrude into the van more than absolutely necessary. So to tackle these issues, I set about drawing it up. Luckily for me, these are pretty simple shapes, so I set about drawing a couple of circles, leaved a little bit of space in between them to keep the two from clanging together, and then offset my lines from those circles to keep the walls nice and thin. For the back mounting plane, I kept the wall much thicker than the ones that would wrap around. This would allow me to do a couple of things to make more material present in the back so we could screw through it. Now, in order to make sure there was more material distributed in the back here, I bored a couple of holes through the back to make the slicer build more walls there, thus distributing more material, thus making the piece stronger there, but only in that part of the model. We spoke about something similar in one of our TPU videos, where we used microstructures to change the strength characteristics only of certain parts of the model. But yes, this made for a strong back, but nice and thin walls up front, and that was what we needed for this project. Finally, I measured the heights of the containers and decided on a good height for the walls of the holder that would allow it to sit in there securely, but not be so high that when you tried to take them out, it would interfere with what was above it. If you had to pull the canister too high up, then that would limit how close you could mount one above it on the wall. So we had to do a little bit of a balance there with keeping it secure so it wouldn't fall out when you slam the door, but also making it easy enough to retrieve that it wasn't going to be a pain. I printed these guys in PETG to account for the hot summer days that they were going to experience inside of the back of that van. That also had the side effect of a bit more strength and reliability when mounting it randomly by sending a screw through the back. PETG has a better chance of not delaminating, so I gave that a go. Now for the next piece, he wanted a little cover for these LED lights on the side of the van. These pieces are very brittle, and they're not supported by Ford anymore. Beyond that, the aftermarket hasn't picked them up either because they're not all that common, and the ones that you can find on eBay are either in rough shape, really expensive, so we're just gonna print some, I think. These lights actually aren't plugged in, and so they're not used in the functional sense anymore. So the lenses were going to be much easier as a result. So here's the requirements. He wanted these to be nice and smooth, as uniform as possible. They needed to be suitable for outdoor use as well because they're going on the exterior of the van. And finally, the piece needed to match the original as closely as possible. Now with this being a cosmetic piece, there was a little bit of consideration that needed to be taken when designing and slicing. Particularly when slicing it, I did decide I was going to print this on an angle instead of flat on any of the sides. First of all, if I printed it flat, it would require a lot more support material, and you guys know how I feel about support material. But beyond that, if I printed in this orientation, then we'd get some ugly stair-stepping at this angle at the top of the model, and that wasn't going to be acceptable. Initially, I thought I'd print it on its side, maybe, and that would get rid of that stair-stepping. But the problem is we've got these little tabs that I need to model in, and that wouldn't really allow provision for that as well. Also, there would be the same amount of support material, effectively, and again, no support material. Now, printing it on the angle allowed for minimal support material. See, I can use some support material. You guys comment, support material's not that bad. If you do your support settings, support material not that bad. I used support material. But printing in this orientation allowed for the tabs to be in plane with the layer lines in such a way that they were still going to be really strong and not a point of fatigue. More importantly, this created a lot more uniform finish because we needed a smooth finish, and this put the layer lines in a very aesthetically pleasing orientation. Next, the weather resistance. So this was like the easiest part to fulfill because you just picked the right plastic for the job. So I chose ASA. ASA's got the good UV resistance while also maintaining really good strength characteristics, and for a piece like this, that was a pretty obvious choice. Beyond that, it prints really easily as well, so we don't have to worry about any of that silly ABS warping nonsense. Finally, this replacement piece needed to match the original piece as closely as possible in dimensions. After taking measurements of the length, width, and height, and then measurements of the smaller features like these tabs and these angles, and effectively mirroring those measurements on both sides of the model, I was able to make it match the original pretty faithfully. And here's a secret, I didn't even use a micrometer. I just used a tape measure and kind of eyeballed it. And they turned out pretty good. Like first try. But by making this match the original as closely as possible, I could ensure that when these were pressed into place, the tabs would snap in like they were meant to do, and everything would just match. So here's how it all went. The tank holder is screwed in nicely, and I used a fuzzy skin to get a super uniform finish and hide the layer lines a little bit. These guys hold the canisters in perfectly and don't have them flying out when you slam the door, but they also allow for easy access like we were aiming for. They stick to the wall just fine because of that thick, strong back that we have on there no matter where you send the screw through, and they don't stick into the van too far, so they're really a pretty convenient solution. Now as for the lens covers, well, those suckers just snapped right in. The support material came off relatively easily. I still don't like support material, I'm never gonna, I'm sorry. I'm not sorry, actually. I just don't like it. Though it did come off easily, there is this small rough edge that I'm not super stoked about, but I pretty well left it alone. Because with it being a small cross-section of the model, it's really not something that detracts from the overall aesthetic of the piece, and by and large it looks good on the van. So these are just two quick ways that consumer-level 3D printing can actually solve problems on a bigger scale. It just takes a little bit of consideration when you're designing it, slicing it, and you choose the right material for the application. Bye!